Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We'll get started with our program in just a moment. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. All right, I'll go ahead and begin our program. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening for the Breaking the Bubble Community Conversation Series, From Space to Place. My name is Glenn Cersoletti, and I serve as Assistant Dean of Students and Director of the Rochester Center for Community Leadership at the University of Rochester. And so pleased and proud to welcome you here this evening. Breaking the Bubble is a community conversation series that addresses timely issues of importance to the local community and of interest to students and other members of the university community as well. The series aims to burst the bubble that can sometimes form between campus and community by creating a space where students and community members can come together to learn and discuss the issues that the Rochester community is facing. The series co-sponsors are the university's Office of Residential Life and Housing Services, as well as the Rochester Center for Community Leadership at the university. This is the fourth year that we've hosted this series, and for the first time ever, we're hosting our first summertime event. This is only the second time that we've hosted the series in this online format. So please bear with us as we sort through the technical details, and I'll cover housekeeping items in just a moment. I want to acknowledge our sponsors, I mentioned already, the Office of Residential Life and Housing Services at the university, and Rebecca Orton is our collaborator from that office, and she oversees the Neighborhood Ambassadors Program, which supports students living off campus, taking leadership roles in their neighborhoods. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague in the Center for Community Leadership, Matt Trombley, who's our tech guru behind the scenes this evening, helping to make sure everything runs smoothly. I also want to acknowledge John Borick, who was a key collaborator in envisioning and establishing this series when we started it 4 years ago, and continued to collaborate and support the series right up until this year. Some of you may know John, a longtime resident of the 19th Ward, and past president, in fact, of the 19th Ward Community Association. So let me now turn to covering some of the housekeeping items for the event this evening. The format will be a presentation in which we do have our presenter has some slides that will be screen sharing here, so you should be able to see those, as well as our presenter, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. And then that will be followed by a question and answer, the conversation portion of our event. So I do want to note that we will be muting all participants during the presentation, but will unmute those when it comes time for the question and answer. I want to also encourage you to go ahead and submit questions using the chat feature during the presentation, and we'll be taking note of those, and you know, we can I can ask them on your behalf afterwards, or I invite you, if you prefer, to raise your hand, use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen in order to let us know that you have a question you'd like to ask. We are recording this evening's event, and we will be posting it on our website for future reference by additional audience members. So just keep that in mind. If you're not comfortable sharing your video, we invite you to be sure to turn off your video before you share your screen. And for University of Rochester students, if you're interested in receiving credit toward the university's Medallion Leadership Program and the Civic Engagement domain, we'll provide information at the very end of the presentation that you'll need to use in order to record your participation and gain credit for the leadership program. I think that covers all the housekeeping items, and I will go ahead then and proceed to introduce our speaker this evening. Maria Ferguelli is Executive Director of the Community Design Center, Rochester. She discovered her love for architecture as a high school student, and applying directly to an ongoing, going on to graduate from the New York Institute of Technology with her bachelor's degree in architecture in 1986, and then became licensed in 1993. Throughout her career in architecture, Maria focused on residential design. And prior to becoming Executive Director of Community Design Center Rochester in 2017, Maria was a longtime volunteer with the organization. She had served as a board member and president of the board. In addition, Maria has experience as a small business owner. She's an avid traveler and is fluent in both Spanish and Italian. And she has served as a guest studio critic for the Rochester Institute of Technology's Masters of Architecture program, and looks forward to other opportunities to mentor students and young professionals. Maria's many interests include accessible and sustainable design, historic reuse and renovation, and advocating for diverse and vibrant neighborhoods. She's particularly interested in placemaking as a tool for transforming the design center's service region and creating a unique identity for Rochester. Nearly a lifelong Rochesterian, Maria firmly believes that her city has all of the ingredients necessary to become a model American city, and she's committed to making that happen. And so Maria will be speaking on the topic tonight of From Space to Place, Placemaking as a Tool for Reimagining Our Community. And the presentation will provide an overview of the work of the Community Design Center Rochester, and will cover foundational placemaking principles and how they can be applied to create diverse and resilient communities. With no further ado, please join me in welcoming Maria Ferguelli.
Hello, everyone. I am very pleased to be here with you today. As Glenn said, we'll learn a little bit about the definitions of urban planning, placemaking principles, a little history on urban development, a little bit about the Community Design Center, and then of course, most importantly, we'll hopefully learn a little bit more about the different strategies that we can employ to make an impact in our communities and neighborhoods. So we start with this distinction between space and place. And typically when I'm in a live audience, I kind of ask the audience, what do you think, the definition is? But since we're not able to do that here, I will just say that space is the physical description of a piece of land, where place connotes an emotional connection to that particular place. Next. Rochester is the heart of our region. Although the human body can maintain some function without having a strong heart, the body can't be considered to be healthy without having a strong heart. And the same is true for our region. The same is true for our region, excuse me, and also for all across this country. Next. These words are some of the challenges that we are dealing with in our city. I believe that urban planning and placemaking are tools that we can use to make a positive impact on these issues. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. Next. And here is a definition of placemaking. Next. Planning usually involves maps, decisions about land use, and specifics about the built environment. How wide is the road? How tall is the building? How deep are the setbacks? Next. And here is a definition that I believe captures the essence of placemaking. In short, placemaking is creating public places that promotes people's health, happiness, and sense of well-being. Next. When you think of placemaking, you might think of something like this. Placemaking has to do with how we shape a space, large or small, based on the identified needs of the community. It includes considerations of programming, what activities take place here, who feels welcome, and who does not. Projects for public spaces, through their extensive research, found that successful places have 4 key elements. They are accessible, engaging, comfortable, and social. Indicators of good places are when you see a group of people gathering together. A higher than average proportion of women is an indication of safety. When you see a diversity of age or a variety of activities and public displays of affection, you know that you're in a good place. Next. In order to make a positive impact on the lives of all the residents in our community, we must go a step further and consider equity in everything that we do. Next. If this is equity, next. And this is, I'm sorry, if that was equality and this is equity, next. Here's the reality. Next. We have to think outside the box in order to find solutions that best serve all members of the community. An important first step is to make sure that we seek the opinions and listen to those who have not had a voice, and to intentionally invite them to the decision-making table. Next. Before we can talk about the way we shape our space, before we can talk about how we shape our space, we can respond to the community's needs in an equitable way. We need to understand that our built environment is an artificial landscape created and built by man. I had an aha moment several years ago when we had a luncheon speaker, Katrina Johnston-Zimmerman, who was an urban anthropologist from Philadelphia, who made this statement that we live in an artificial environment that was created by somebody for somebody. Next. And so space has always been intentionally manufactured to shape and represent value. The question is, whose values and for whose benefit? Can we imagine how different our world would look if children designed our space, or if the elderly, or perhaps women or minorities? What amazing contributions these varying perspectives would lend to our built environment. Next. When budgets are tight, the first thing to be eliminated is design. We often confuse aesthetics with design. We think of design as decoration. It's extra, it's the fluff, it's the icing on the cake. Next. But design is not extra, it's essential. It's the cake, especially when you have limited resources. Next. And so what is design? Often people feel that they do not have the expertise to comment on urban planning or design issues. The reality is that we are all designers. We design our day, our wardrobe, our meals, and our homes. Next. We can all discern the difference between good and bad design. This is evidenced in the way that spaces are used or not used, or by the value that is attached to them, both emotional and economic. Next. So good design is good business. So why are we willing to put up with bad design in poorly planned spaces? Next. We know that urban places developed organically over time. These places were walkable and provided a variety of goods and services that were needed for the residents' daily lives. With the advent and popularity of the car, roads began to dictate how cities were designed, and the function of the road became the exclusive domain of the car and other motorized vehicles. Street life, what we often refer to as vibrancy, is created by people on the sidewalk, not by cars on the street. As cars took over our cities, one can argue that vibrancy was lost. It is my opinion that the single best strategy that we can implement for creating vibrant places again is walkability. Walkability encompasses all the other aspects needed for vibrancy. Just because things are in close proximity doesn't mean that they are walkable. Creating a continuous street edge is imperative to creating an engaging experience necessary for walkability. Next. In many cities, The vehicular right-of-way is the largest public space available. It makes sense that this space should be designed for safe use by everyone. Complete streets are streets designed and operated to enable safe use and support mobility of all users. Those include people of all ages and abilities, regardless of whether they are traveling as drivers, pedestrians, bicyclists, or public transit riders. This is how the U.S. Department of Transportation defines complete streets. Next. And here is what an illustration of what a complete street might look like. Next. This is a proposed solution for making Monroe Avenue a more walkable environment, and it came from the 2010 community design charrette that we did with Brighton. You'll notice across the top of the screen is a map. The orange blocks are the buildings, and you'll notice that they basically have a similar setback off the roadway. The lower portion indicates a design proposal that takes all the traffic and limits it to 3 lanes in the center, borders it with bicycle lanes on each side, protects it with a curbed green space and treed lawn, and then creates a continuous sidewalk in front of the buildings to connect all the buildings together. And then a slow lane where public parking is public parking is available. The trick is, how do we convince all those business owners to give up their private parking, which they're able to control? So certainly the municipality has to come up with some way of offering a benefit to these business owners so that they may consider giving up their private parking to allow for something like this to happen. Next. One of the biggest problems is that cars take up a lot of space, not only when they're moving, but especially when they're not. Next. In 2014, Rochester won the Parking Madness title, claimed the Golden Crater. Trust me, this is not a coveted award. The demand for more auto-related infrastructure continues to degrade the urban fabric of our cities. The car has and continues to be a negative impact on our urban places. Next. And now I want to share with you a little bit of information about who we are. The Community Design Center was born out of a proposal by the Department of Transportation to widen University Avenue to 4 lanes in order to facilitate commuter traffic. There was a group of neighbors that organized and argued against this proposal, stating that it would be detrimental to their sense of place. Thankfully, one of those members had a group of friends who had the expertise to design and propose what they felt would be a wonderful neighborhood street. And they were able to convince DOT that this proposal was more appropriate. So DOT scrapped the original plan and implemented the redesigned streetscape, and that became known as Art Walk. And so the Community Design Center continued on as a group of architects and planners, was formally founded as a not-for-profit in 2003, and has now been serving the community for nearly 2 decades. We serve a 9-county area in Western New York, and we're one of a handful of community design centers that are self-sustaining, meaning that we are not associated with a municipal or government agency or an academic institution. Our independence is what allows us to put the community's best interests at the forefront of our work. Next. Community design centers traditionally work in economically distressed communities. We are ground zero, helping to organize, educate, and empower community members around concepts of placemaking and community building through the way they shape their physical environment. I particularly like the lower definition that says design centers for design and planning professions. Community design centers have been the equivalent of what health clinics are to medicine and what legal aid is to law. Next. Community Design Center Rochester promotes design excellence of the built environment as a way to enrich a sense of place, improve sustainability, and enhance the quality of life of our region's citizens. We accomplish our mission through advocacy, education, and by facilitating a grassroots community engagement process. Of all the programs that we do, I want to focus particularly on the community engagement piece. Next. Perhaps the most important work that we do is the community engagement. And our primary tool for accomplishing this is the charrette. Next. We believe strongly in a planning process that is informed by an extensive community engagement process, not in response to a project, but rather from the beginning, before a project is conceived. The Community Design Center Rochester has facilitated more than 30 community design charrettes, both in the city center and throughout the region. The charrette is a valuable tool for improving communication, sharing ideas, educating about strategies, and building relationships. Next. We advocate for complete streets, preservation of historic structures, adaptive reuse of existing buildings, and the benefits of creating walkable communities, to name a few. This is the Village Gate Complex. Restored over the course of 20 years, it has become one of Rochester's best gathering places. Next. We recognize the value of preserving structures that connect us to our past and that hold memories of that particular place. This is the Flatiron Building, whose restoration was catalytic for the revitalization of the neighborhood of the arts. Next. Every building that once looked like this can become a link that connects our past to our future. These revitalized spaces contribute greatly to our sense of being and provide wonderful new opportunities to create interesting and engaging places. Next. And every building that has found new life once looked like this. This is the Cunningham Carriage Factory, which sat vacant for several decades until it was identified at the Susan B. Anthony Community Design Charrette as a building that should be brought back to life. Next. So sustainability is not only about the materials, but it also is about the emotional connection and adaptability. Next. We support the new urbanism principles that seek to recreate the ways that cities originally developed. Here we see a map of downtown Rochester in 1931. At this time, Rochester was at its peak population of just over 328,000 people. Like many cities, Rochester lost population as the advent of the car helped people who had the financial resources to leave the city in search of the American dream of home ownership in the unspoiled countryside. This phenomenon became known as urban sprawl. Next. Community design centers were created in part as a response to the urban renewal projects that demolished vast parts of cities to make way for auto-related infrastructure. Here you see the construction of the Inner Loop in 1961, a below-grade highway bypass, which when completed, separated the urban core from the rest of the city. Next. Currently, we're in the process of filling in the Inner Loop. In doing so, the fabric of the city is being reconnected. This is in response to some of the lessons that we have learned from our development patterns of the last 50 years. Next. Not only does the removal of this scar help to heal the community by reconnecting the fabric of the city, but it also right-sizes the roadway, and in so doing, frees up the land for new development. Here we see the 6 acres of new parcels that were created when the eastern portion of the Inner Loop was filled in. Connectivity is an important component for creating vibrant places. As the success of this project is demonstrated, we are now looking to consider the removal of the northern portion of the Inner Loop. Next. Our physical, and emotional health is directly impacted by our environment, both natural and man-made. There is much research to indicate that development patterns of the last 50 years has been responsible in part for the ill health of the individual, the community, and the planet. Next. New urbanism is a planning and development approach based on the principles of how cities and towns had been built for the last several centuries. Walkable, mixed use, inclusive and diverse communities are common features. New urbanism focuses on human-scaled urban design that aims to provide a variety of choices. Next. The desire to make better use of our resources, be connected to community, and have a more equitable society is making living in compact, more densely populated areas attractive to young and old, providing a savings of time and resources. Next. We are finding that people are drawn to spaces that are intimate, interesting, and engaging. This is what is commonly referred to as authentic space. The unique experience provided by a particular place is based on its history, distinguishing features, and use of local resources. Next. By combining the new urbanism principles with the local resources, the geographic location, natural features, and historic references of a particular place, you are able to create that unique identity that reinforces that community's sense of place. Sense of place is another important component in creating vibrant places. Next. So how do these placemaking strategies help to contribute to improving the quality of life for our residents? I believe that these are the three most important elements of placemaking, and we'll go into each one a little bit in more detail. Next. Housing equity is about providing access to good quality, affordable, and diverse housing options. We used to gauge the health of a neighborhood by the rate of owner-occupied units. Perhaps a better metric now is how long people stay in their homes, regardless of whether they own or rent. By staying in their homes longer, it's an indication that they're relatively satisfied with the housing unit, with the neighborhood in which it exists, and it allows the resident to build social networks, which in turn allows them to share resources. Next. After World War II, the image of the American dream became defined by owning a single-family home in the pristine countryside. We know that owning real estate was and continues to be a foundational tool for building wealth. This dream became a reality for many Americans when the National Housing Act of 1934 was enacted to create 30-year mortgages at low fixed interest rates that were insured by the federal government. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was created and charged with developing criteria for insuring the loans and assessing the risks. The HOLC created a residential security map, which indicated presumed risk where properties were rated by color, from most desirable, outlined in green, to detrimental, outlined in red. These maps came to be known as redlining. The presence of foreign-born, Black or brown people guaranteed that that property would be redlined, despite any evidence that those persons posed any greater risk, thereby excluding foreign, Black, or brown people access to resources that were available to white Americans. The practice of redlining institutionalized and spread the use of racial covenants, which in turn contributed to the creation of monocultural housing developments. The explicit link between spatial desirability and racial occupancy became known as the racialization of space. Next. Providing diverse housing options allows for anyone to find where they can fit into the neighborhood and contribute to a community. Diversity is desired not only in size, which in turn relates to affordability, but also in building type. Here you see the multi-story apartment building peacefully coexisting next to a single-family home. This type of diversity is not typically allowed with current single-use zoning, also known as Euclidean zoning, which is what we have here. Euclidean zoning separates land by uses, typically into three categories: residential, commercial, and industrial. You can imagine how single-family zoning is also exclusionary, limiting access to those that had the resources in order to afford such property. One step in densifying and diversifying current neighborhoods is to allow the use of accessory dwelling units, typically called ADUs. This is a way to allow a property to be subdivided to include perhaps an apartment in the garage or a studio in the attic. Next. Access to reliable mobility options is imperative. Creating safe places where people can implement their chosen form of mobility is crucial for their success. That is why it is important to design complete streets and a connected network of buses, bike lanes, and sidewalks in order to provide the safe place for people to get around however they choose. The more transit options you have available, the more valuable that place becomes. Next. As is indicated by a walk score, the most affordable and accessible option for most people is walking. But in order for walking to be effective, we must promote zoning changes that allow for mixed-use buildings in mixed-use neighborhoods. When my family first immigrated to this country, we lived in a small village called East Rochester, which was also home to a business that was called Piano Works that made parts and assembled pianos. We lived on the east end of Chestnut Street, and my grandparents lived on the far west end of Chestnut Street. And my grandfather was employed at Piano Works, and he was never late to work, nor did he ever miss a day, because he was completely in control of his mobility. He walked to work every day. As a matter of fact, he walked back and forth from work 4 times a day. He came home at noon for lunch and went back in the afternoon. So walkability has many other benefits than just control. How many times does someone have to walk up and down the street before you realize that that person is a member of your community? You know that person lives up the street this way and goes to work down the street that way. If that person stumbles and falls on the sidewalk, you'd be inclined to come and render assistance because that person is a member of your community. And so walkability has benefits, not only fiscal in that you don't have to spend money to walk except for the expense of a good pair of shoes. It has social benefits in that you have more intimate opportunities for engagement. Has health benefits because it builds exercise into your daily routine. And it has community benefits because all of a sudden, as a community, you have a network, a social network that you can rely on. And so there are many, many benefits to walkability. Next. So a mixed-use building is a building that hosts a variety of uses within the same structure. This is typically in the form of a business that has a storefront at the street level and some apartments above it. This can also be live-work units for artists or for others. Multi-use neighborhoods allow for different uses to exist within the same neighborhood, such as having a convenience store or hardware store, a restaurant, or a shop. It is important that we plan mixed-use buildings and neighborhoods where most residents can find the goods and services that they need in their daily lives within walking distance. Here's a sketch made by Roger Brown, our founding father, showing how the facades of a series of buildings on Main Street could be improved to create a better streetscape. It also illustrates a great example of a variety of buildings that coexist on the street. Some are clearly houses that have been converted to have a business as a storefront. Some are single-use, one-story buildings. And then on the left, you see a couple of examples of really wonderful multi-story, multi-use buildings that are typical on streets in any community. Next. And so our goal is to help create a community where most of your daily needs are met within your neighborhood. This would be something like every neighborhood having a small commercial district that is within walking distance of people's homes, and an entire city being comprised of a series of these little urban villages. Most importantly, what is wonderful about this is the image of this picture. Predating the car, you see how vibrant the street was, how important the street was to daily life, for commerce, for socializing, for sharing news. And so what we would do to be able to return to that kind of vibrancy on our urban streets today. Next. So there's a very close relationship between how we create space and how people use it. In other words, the way we build our physical environment directly influences how we build community. These are the strategies that we've identified in creating a better place. We understand that the more diversity we can incorporate into the space, unit size, use, price range, the more likely it is that we will attract a diverse population. Not only does diversity make a place more interesting, it also makes it stronger. And this is what we refer to as a resilient community. And in times of crisis, such as what we've experienced recently with the pandemic, we become ever more aware of how our communities function, how useful they are for our daily lives when we have to rely on systems that are different than what we're used to. And so perhaps through this crisis, we often hear that innovation is born out of crisis. Perhaps we've discovered some new ways to use our streets, some new businesses to support in our neighborhoods, and perhaps we'll choose different ways to live if we could. Next.
It's not just about design, it's about community. It's about creating the place in which people who live there could feel that this is our neighborhood, this is theirs.
So we've been so excited about the race and enthralled in the pageantry of the event that it isn't until the gun goes off and the horses run out of the gates that we realize that we overlooked one critical element. We forgot to put a jockey on the horse. Urban planning, placemaking, design, and development have a critical role to play in community building, but creating great communities has to start with the people. Community engagement is the most critical tool for informing development and ensuring success. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So we've already had some discussion on the chat function. I'll be referencing that and drawing from that as we shift into the community conversation segment of our evening here. But as we do that, I do want to offer a couple of reminders. If you, we are recording the event this evening, so if you do want to speak your question and you're comfortable with your image being saved in the recording, just remember to turn off your video. Or of course you have the option of posting your question in the chat function as well. So again, keep questions coming via chat, and please raise hands too if you want to speak your question. But I want to turn first to the chat, and there were several comments and a few questions there as well. Calvin, past speaker in our series, from Calvin Eaton from 540 West Main Street, made a comment there, a couple of comments, pointing out some of the history of that has created this segregation that we see evident in Rochester today, and some of which Maria touched on as well. And Calvin, I want to invite you, if you want to follow up on your comments or share any questions for Maria based on that. I also want to acknowledge Eleanor Coleman also commented, participated in that conversation as well, and made some really interesting observations about the photos, you know, really providing evidence of the segregation that's taken place in the Rochester community.
Yeah, the Design Center, Community Design Center did an awesome job on Legacy Park Station, which is a plot of land on Cottage and South Plymouth. Lentori Johnson is working on that now, and it's about making sure that gentrification can't impact at least this one little area where they're going to highlight African Americans in the community who have contributed, both present and past. But I noticed when we were creating those that the photos that they originally had were mostly white people. And even when you just did your presentation, so many of the photos, they're mostly white people. And right away, I start to look at that and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not very diverse. So I just want you to be aware of that.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate you pointing that out. I've also noticed so many images when we're talking about public spaces don't show a lot of diversity, and I will certainly make a point of trying to capture that better in our images. We often talk about creating space for everyone, but when we show these images or when we go to these spaces to photograph, we realize that they're not really being used by everyone, and that begs the question, why? And what do we need to do to make it so that space becomes a better community asset for all members of the community? But I appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah, and I think I'm unmuted. I appreciate Eleanor bringing that point out. And I think I just wanted to make sure that as folks talk about the narrative of, especially how Rochester has been developed over the years, decades. You know, when we talk about suburban sprawl and quote unquote people wanting to move to the suburbs and all that, how that happened, that was done very intentionally by design. The federal, local, state governments were complicit in creating opportunities for white residents that that Black residents could not take a part of, as it pertained to home ownership, as it pertained to redlining that happened in our city that deemed many of the neighborhoods on the west side and east side of our city, Joseph Avenue, North Clinton, West Main Street, South Plymouth, they were neighborhoods that many of them were redlined and considered undesirable. So a great book that further highlights how none of this happened by accident, or it wasn't individual, you know, just communities wanting to segregate themselves, but it was very intentional. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, who came to Rochester, I believe it was last summer. Everyone should read that. It should be required reading for anyone in the urban planning space or architecture, etc. So we have to continue to make sure that we are embedding those facts in these conversations, because it's important that we highlight that Rochester continues to be one of the most segregated cities of its size in the nation to this day. And the Penfield city border is one of the most segregated in the nation as it pertains to school districts. So there's still a lot of work to do, and all of this history has a very direct present day implications for the city that we all exist in. And so it's important that we continue to highlight this history which so many of us have not been taught and do not know. And the more that we don't talk about it in 2020, we continue to be complicit in that erasure.
Thank you, Calvin. I agree with you 100%. It's a very complex issue with many components, and I trying to educate myself, and I try to make reference to it because I wanted to acknowledge it, but there are many layers, and the reason I included in the presentation this slide of the room of white guys is exactly kind of to make that point, to show that, you know, our whole environment's been created by only one perspective, one point of view. And there are so many other things that contributed to the situation where we find ourselves now. And it's so very important for us to continue to educate ourselves and to share as much as we can learn with others. So I appreciate you doing that.
I echo my thanks to Calvin and for the work that you do on an ongoing basis at 540 West Main and helping to unerase that history in our community. It's a nice segue here. Dennis, who has been participated in planning past events. Thanks for joining us, Dennis. And you commented that she's actually curious as to how we might utilize urban design to undo segregation and inequality that's been caused by that history of redlining in Rochester. And so if that the segregation that we now see evident that Calvin was describing is sort of done by design, how might we think about using the principles and tools that you described tonight, Maria, to sort of undesign that or redesign that?
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding that these tools were created and implemented very intentionally also gives us the realization that they can be used very intentionally again to undo or to repair, I should say, so much of the damage that has been done. And so that is the primary thing, is to understand that we do have these tools and that we need to use them very carefully and intentionally in creating new opportunities for people. One of the biggest things that we are a proponent of is that community engagement, trying to give people a voice in their neighborhoods, letting them be the experts in their communities, and trying to get municipalities to recognize that. So often, a lot of design happens from the top down, where people who think they know better will impose their idea or their project on a community. And it's so important to let the community choose for themselves what they do. So essential to the equation is that foundation of giving people in the neighborhoods a voice and helping them have the tools and the strategies so that they can become advocates for themselves. But the important part is for us that are designers and planners is to listen, to come in and listen and be a resource for the community rather than be an expert for the community. So that's just a foundational thing. And then so many other things that we can do. One of the things we know is that home ownership was a way for building wealth. And so how do we've struggled with this for a long time, but how do we create an opportunity for more people to have access to being able to own property? So understanding what some of the challenges are and then creating the tools, the support mechanisms to help people who want to have property have the ability to do so. That would be another key element. There are so many things that we need to do, but starting with those foundational things is a good place to start.
Thanks, Maria. I want to go on to another question that was submitted in chat, and I just want to acknowledge, Eva, I see you have your hand up, so I'll put you on the list here, and Dennis, I see you submitted another question in chat after that. Laura, who has been a regular attendee at our Breaking the Bubble events and now a graduate student at the Warner School of Education, asks, have there been any conversations between the Community Design Center Rochester and the university concerning the lack of physical accessibility on the U of R campus?
No, I have not had specific conversations about that, although we do have a very good relationship with the U of R administration in general, mostly in regards to programming. But we exist as a community resource, so certainly you as a community member can reach out to us and make us aware of ways that we might be helpful. So if this is something that you believe we might be able to influence and help facilitate change, please do reach out to us directly and we'll see how and what we can do.
Thanks, Maria. And I would just add, if I may, that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the current board chair of the Community Design Center is the former university architect, Paul Tankel,
Correct.
And so very familiar with the university and its design. And I'm happy to help facilitate that connection, Laura, if you or anyone else would like to follow up on that. Let's see, Eva, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I think you're next if you
Yes.
want to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to say that I believe that in order to promote diversity, we need also to carry about the external links of Rochester, like with Rochester neighbors, because the whole presentation was mostly about the interconnections and about the development of the city itself and how to promote the people who are living in Rochester. But I also think that one of the goals actually is to approach other people, like foreigners, to come to Rochester to see it and most likely to stay there. So I think it's not only the design of certain places, but it is actually the distribution of design. I believe that most cities are going to center all the most important, the center of the city is, as the same word says, in the center. But what about the bigger circle? What about it? It is usually empty in every city, and every city is mostly more or less pretty much abandoned near its boundaries, because these are somehow left over. No one cares actually about it. I think actually it's one of the major connections that can draw many foreigners and thus make the diversity even better.
I agree with you. We have worked so much in urban space, and I use Rochester as an example because it's familiar to us. But really the concepts that I'm talking about are applicable anywhere. And we work in rural spaces as well as suburban spaces as well. And the way I define urban space is generally any place where there's a desire for density. So villages could be an urban space. But I do understand what you're saying about cities, and that's one of the things that when bringing up the concept of these urban villages, how can we develop neighborhoods into their own kind of communities that have everything that you need for your basic living, and yet you are tied to the greater city because you have other neighboring neighbors, other neighboring neighborhoods, and people that you know that live in other places. So that's certainly one way to build up the individual parts of the city that are not the most popular. In the old times, you used to have some really rich character in very specific neighborhoods. You had African-American cultural places that were very, very rich. You had ethnic places that were very, very rich. And somehow we've lost that. So it would be an interesting thing to work at, to study, how can we bring that back? And as much as we say that diversity is really important, it's not always needed for a place to be a really vibrant place. A vibrant place can be a culture of people that have a lot of things in common, that are sharing their customs and their food. But in general, we're often talking about diversity being a strength for a community. But I'd love to explore that whole concept more, but I find that foreign people and minorities are generally not, the foundational thing we have to do is help people understand that everyone has valuable ways that they can contribute to community. And so that we can really start to hear all those diverse voices. I think that is a really key element of being able to enrich our neighborhoods in the way that you speak of.
Dennis posted another question in the chat asking, do you work with any community land trusts in Rochester? And she thanks you in advance for your response.
We do not work directly with, we're familiar with the work of the various land trusts. Certainly, I think there's so much, that we can do to make access better So there are some models that exist, but there's also opportunities for new models to be created. So as community members, as you start to identify specific needs, there may be a possibility that we can start to create steps or ways to start to solve some of these problems that perhaps haven't been solved in a way that's a model that's currently existing. So no, we don't work specifically directly with them, but I am aware of the work and certainly support the work that they do.
Thanks, Maria. And Eleanor made a comment about reparation, and she says reparation is about wealth versus increased income. Systemic racism has ensured that African Americans cannot have wealth, which develops over time. So extending opportunities to own housing is crucial in developing wealth. We haven't lost businesses, we drove them out, and giving the example of Cornhill. And I wonder if I can sort of piggyback on Eleanor's comment here to pose a question. I know at the university, I have lots of conversations with students and faculty and others about gentrification and displacement of local residents, and particularly the impact that the university is having on surrounding neighborhoods near campus and on the southwest of Rochester in particular. And so I wonder, Maria, how you think about those issues in the context of placemaking and urban design that you discussed tonight.
Well, again, because placemaking is a people-centered process, the important thing is for large institutions like the university, I know that their expansion into the neighborhood across the river was something that was seen as beneficial both for the community and from the for the university, and from the university's point of view for the community, but it wasn't something that was done in partnership with the community. So I think the key element would be for people that have the means, institutions that have the means, to seek out the partners in the community to develop a program where they find a mutually beneficial project that everyone can sign on to. This is not often the case. The case is often that someone thinks they're doing something really good and then goes ahead and does it. And then they're seen from the other party as invading or taking over or abusing their authority or whatever. So initially what I say is always seek partnerships, always try to have an open dialogue, always, even though you're acting in what you believe is the best interest of the community, make sure that you go and talk to the people that are being impacted to have them tell you what they see as being the way that you can help. I know that gentrification is a big issue and it's just happened. Displacement has happened in many ways. I've also worked in neighborhoods where we need property values to rise in order to get better services and better businesses in the neighborhood. So an example that I can give you is that we're working on the Lyle Avenue corridor and trying to help create an identity for that space. In walking up and down the corridor, we noticed that it's just car sales floor after car, sales floor after mechanic. And the reason that these uses are predominant in this area is because the land value is so low that it was easy for these uses that are looking for low cost land to operate. And so as you bring more value to the land, as the space becomes more desirable, it again pushes some of these uses out. But hopefully it brings more diverse uses into the neighborhood. So in a way, you need the land values to rise in order for people to be able to benefit from that from that investment. Certainly, we always want to be conscious of pushing people out from a neighborhood where they live.
Thanks, Maria. I'm cognizant of the time. We're almost to the end of our scheduled time, and I know that we have additional questions that have been submitted. I feel like we've started a conversation, which is exactly what we set out to do with this series. And so I apologize for having to cut things off. Before we do conclude, I do want to offer a comment and ask you to share a little bit more, Maria, and follow up to that last question and your answer, your response to it. But I know that the Community Design Center Rochester has some additional talks coming up in the fall, and I believe one of those is I think will be insightful in terms of thinking at a context, speaker from Buffalo in a context that's very similar to Rochester. And so I wonder if you can say a little bit about those events in the fall.
Sure. So one of our best known programs is our Reshaping Rochester lecture series, where we bring experts from all over the country to share their insights about situations that we've identified in Rochester as needing some attention. And so one of our speakers for this year's series, let me back up a minute and say that this year's series was intended to celebrate the contributions of women in design because it's such an important year for women. Unfortunately, our series was interrupted with the pandemic. And so our March and April lectures have been postponed to September and October. And our next speaker is Bernice Rattle, who is a female developer and activist in Buffalo. She created a company called Buffalo Love. And her whole concept of incremental development has been really impactful for her neighborhood and her community. Her reason for creating this business was not to make money, but rather to have a positive influence in her neighborhood. And so the people that she employs, all the projects that she does are all right there within her community. And she will be here to speak in September. So please look at our website and the exact date will be listed. The events are free and open to the public, so we hope that you will attend. And then the follow-up event is Carol Naughton, who is the CEO of Purposeful Communities. And in Rochester on East Main Street in Beechwood and Emma neighborhoods, we have a group called Connected Communities that's trying to become a purpose-built community. And so there's this really great connection between purpose-built community and some of the work that's happening here in Rochester. And it's all about holistic community development. So hopefully you'll find that interesting as well. And the last thing I wanted to throw out to all of you is that I would love to host you at the Community Design Center. Come visit me at our office and gallery when things hopefully improve, but even we can accommodate a guest at a time. I'm happy to show you some of the work that we do. Reach out to me. You can have my contact information from Glenn, and I'm happy to engage with any conversations that you're willing to have with me. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Maria, so much for your time and sharing your insights and perspectives with all of us and engaging in this conversation this evening. I want to thank all of you for attending and participating in the conversation as well, and encourage you, as Maria, encourage you to take up Maria's invitation to follow up and learn more about urban design and placemaking. We didn't even get to a piece of what I wanted to delve into more, which is the fact that placemaking figures prominently in the City of Rochester's 2034 comprehensive plan. And so I think there's lots of opportunities for all of us to engage further in this conversation and this work to try to, as Dennis, I think, said in the chat, to use these design principles to redesign our communities in a way that undo some of the historical harms that have been done, that have been inflicted on people of color in the community. So again, thank you. I